Very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My name's Bob Digby, and I'll be talking you through this session this afternoon on A-level geography coursework marking training. And I bet you're looking forward to marking all those again, aren't you? After having had what you thought was probably about 6 months off, something like that, from the last time you got rid of last year's, here we are again and ready to mark again. So it's one of those things that comes around once a year, a bit like Christmas. And we find that most teachers really like to have a little bit of a refresher on marking the NEA and what that's like and what the issues are and so on. I've been the assistant principal examiner for a couple of years to the principal examiner, and we have to say that the quality of work generally is really very, very good. But there are some common issues, and I'll try and cover some of those this afternoon in the session. So this is really all part of the coursework marking training that Pearson have put on for teachers this year. If you've been following the modular program so far, this is module number 4. Just a couple of things to say to you. First of all, we'll be finishing at 5:30 this afternoon. If you have any technical problems, so if you've, for instance, got problems with sound quality or picture quality, anything like that, could you enter those technical queries, as I call them, into the chat box? We've got Laura Westcott and John Walton with us this afternoon, both from Pearson, and they'll be taking questions. So if you've got particular questions about the NEA, there's a Q&A box next to the chat box, which we'd like you to put any sort of geography NEA related questions into the Q&A box, please, if you would. It just means that anybody who's slightly sort of panicky and think they're missing out on something, it means that their queries about technical problems don't get lost in amongst a whole lot of question and answers that Laura and John may be wanting to get through. Okay. What we're going to be doing for the course of the afternoon, you hopefully will have received an email last week in which you received a sample of the piece of the work that we'll be looking at. We're going to be looking at a single NEA, and if you've had a chance to read through that, then that will have served you well, and we'll be going through the mark scheme and how the mark scheme applies to that exemplar. It's about studentification in and around Bristol University. So that'll be hopefully, if you've had a chance to receive that and download that piece of work and look at it, that'll really help you. If you haven't, there'll be a little bit of time allowed for you to go through this afternoon and look at the piece of work. You can download that from the delegate folder in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. So hopefully you'll be able to catch up, and it will still make a good session, even though you might be chasing a little bit behind if you haven't had a chance to look at it yet. One of the things that we really were keen to show you about this work, though, it's a nice piece of work that students can do. It's very repeatable. That's a question we often ask when we're moderating that. Is this a piece of work that, on the basis of the methods given, you could imagine one of your students going out and just saying, yeah, I could do this. So it's very nice from that point of view, and it's a local study, and it's something that student has really planned for themselves. So hopefully you'll get a great deal out of looking at that this afternoon. Okay, let's move on. So clearly, I've really covered that in the introduction. Let's move on beyond that. That's what we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at the marks awarded to an NEA exemplar, 4 sections to the mark scheme. The ones that are most controversial, if there is any disagreement about marks, it tends to be in sections 3 and 4. Most of what we see in terms of section 1, the introduction, setting the scene, as I call it, and section 2 on methodology, marks tend to be fairly well in agreement between moderators and teacher markers. But if they are going to go astray, and not that many do, but if they are going to go astray, it tends to be in sections 3 and 4. So we'll be focusing particularly on the marks, not from the point of view of getting it right. That'd be nice if you do agree with the marks that we agree on this afternoon. But really, the purpose of the session is how the work meets the criteria in the mark scheme and why it gets awarded particular marks rather than other marks. Towards the end of the session, we'll cover some frequently asked questions as well about things like setting up particular titles and so on. The questions that teachers have been asking in the last year or so. So first of all, I'm going to mute my at least get rid of the picture from me, so that we don't take up too much bandwidth just by looking at me. You don't need that. You need the presentation. So the first thing I would like you to do this afternoon is just complete this poll, which we're going to bring up on screen now. It's about how long you've been running the NEA. So is it your first time this year, or is it 1 to 3 years, or is it four or more years? At the moment, we've got quite a lot of people at the moment. Out of the 34 people who've completed so far, hopefully there'll be some more, because there's 67 people that I can see so far, though some of you, of course, might be sharing a screen. But it's roughly evenly split between about a third of you as first time with the NEA. So it's really helpful for me to know that. So if any of you who've been are in the 4 or more years category, you find that you're being told things that you knew, forgive me, because I will try and cover a few things to make this meaningful for everybody. So people who are on their first time through will understand just as much by the end of the session, hopefully. And there's about 28% who've got between 1 and 3 years. So I'll end the poll there. It's really useful to have that first of all. So we got roughly one third. We'll just share the results now so you can see those. And hopefully you can see who the audience consists of. Okay, let's stop sharing that. Share the results. Okay, perhaps we can now get rid of that poll then, please. That'll be really useful. And we'll move on to the next slide. The next poll is about your concerns about the NEA. And this is really for the kind of concerns that you might have as a teacher. What sort of things concern you? So we've got poll number 2. If we could have that please up on screen. So what are the main concerns you have about marking the NEA this year? Is it the number of data collection techniques? Do you worry about that and how many of your students are meant to demonstrate? Or is it choosing the right level in the mark scheme? Or is it comparability of data collected in the field and virtual data? We've had a sort of post-pandemic worry about that in the past, which is why that was included as one of the options in this poll. And then allocating marks within the levels. Well, it won't surprise any of you, probably before you see the results, to know the biggest concern by far is allocating marks within the levels. Now, clearly you can click on more than one option here, so the results will add up to more than 100%. But you can see there that if I end the poll there now, then share the results with you, you can see the biggest problem that people see is the allocation of marks within the levels. So that's really what we're going to be spending the time on this afternoon. But of course, we will deal with things like number of data collection techniques. I'll deal with that fairly soon, hopefully. So this is the title we'll be looking at for this afternoon: Assessing the Conflict Caused by Studentification in Clifton in Bristol. I like the title. It's one of the, it's a bit of an exam question kind of command word, isn't it, really? And you don't see many that use it in this way. But it does avoid some of the words that students tend to find they're wading through treacle with. The word impact is always a little bit difficult for students. And the word success is as well in any regeneration project. So it's quite nice to see that this is quite clear about assessing the conflict caused by studentification in Bristol, because it makes the assumption, of course, that there is conflict. Now, the first thing that you'll likely come across with your student work is forms like this: the independent investigation form, the proposal form, as it's generally known. And this is the particular form from this piece of work. And the teacher comments are in red at the bottom. And you'll notice, if you just scan over your eyes over the proposal form, towards the top, the student has set out 4 very useful questions. And that it's helpful if the student has got the title right in a general sense, but also the planned investigation sub-questions, got those right as well. Now, 4 is slightly on the high list. Most students do 3, but actually in this particular case, I think there's the justification for those 4. The useful thing about those is that you can almost imagine when the student comes to doing the analysis, those 4 sub-questions will form the basis of the analysis. And then the investigation title will form the basis of the conclusion. And I think that's a really useful thing to get into students' minds. When they're writing something like this, they're actually really writing the plan of their study and what it's going to look like. So that's a very useful thing to have. The second thing that's worth saying is don't forget, you can have a lot of discussion with individuals and with groups of students about this form and about getting it right. When you sign this off, you're really saying to the student, yep, this is going to be fine for you. I haven't told you what to do. So no teacher would ever hopefully say, I want you to do 3 environmental quality surveys or anything like that, or take lots of photographs that you can annotate and so on. Not specific like that, but some of the advice that's given here is about relating things to the specification, about focusing on the word conflict, about making it local and making it manageable. All of this is really useful. And it's also useful to keep a check on things that the student has got in their mind about what they might actually do. Now, the middle row about the investigation focus, it's a little bit generalized in many ways, but the student's got a chance to go away and think that through once they've actually had their title approved by the teacher. You can begin to then think what they might be considering. So they might be thinking about studentification and how they're going to measure social conflict or environmental conflict or economic conflict. Are there any economic conflicts that occur in the area? And which of these perhaps occur and cause the most substantial conflict, so that you can see questions about the way in which this is going. The students mentioned a comment about how accessible the area is for them. And then there's a brief outline of a planned methodology, which gives you a sense of what the student's going to be doing. They don't need to write down every single thing that they're doing. You don't need a long list. What you do need is a list of things that the student has really thought about. So primary data will consist of environmental surveys and questionnaires, in brackets stratified. Now, sampling is something we'll talk about later, but at this point in time, we can see the students done a little bit of thinking about what kind of questionnaire data they might be doing, or at least how they might be collecting their questionnaire data. Asking people's opinions on studentification. Secondary data will look at housing composition of Bristol to see what percentage of Bristol student accommodation is. So we're beginning to get an idea. You could launch this one and say, yeah, I think that's absolutely fine. You're ready to go. And the teacher has advised the student correctly to focus on conflicts, and we'll be talking more about that later, and advising them to keep it local. We have so many studies that we see when we're moderating as a team of moderators that are looking at, say, the success of regeneration in Stratford in East London. Stratford's got a population of about 140,000. It's way, way too big. The ideal size of area is really at the largest, I think, really the council ward, which is normally about 1/20th, that sort of area of a borough or a county council. Really no bigger than that, and very often a good deal smaller. So I think it's useful for the teacher to use this proposal form and get an idea of just what sort of size area is the student thinking of. When you get the pieces of work in, it's always useful, and you might think, well, this is going to take extra time in marking it, but it's really useful. There are marks for each of the 4 sections of the NEA, as many of you who've marked these before will know. But evidence of these can be found anywhere within the NEA. So for instance, where you might expect to see background reading is perhaps in the introduction, but it's quite possible that background reading might occur in, say, the analysis, or even some data taken from a publication, for instance, in the data collection, or actually the student might be referring to data that they've collected and some of the mini conclusions that they've drawn, and compared it with other conclusions that they'd read about elsewhere, perhaps in their course textbook or in an article in Geography Review or something like that. So our advice always, and I think this really does constitute best practice, is to read through the whole investigation first before you award any section marks. And it's always helpful so that you're prepared really for what you're going to be marking. So if there is, for instance, evaluation of methods, you'd expect to see that in the methodology, but you might well expect to see that as well in the evaluation at the end about how successful the methods have been. So read through the whole thing first is our strong advice. Careful reading of the final conclusions and critical evaluation often helps in deciding which level the first 2 sections may be placed. You might find that, say, the methodology in 1 or 2 sections might be a little bit thin, but it may be more is said about it in with the results and about the reliability of data that's being collected, as well as, for instance, in the evaluation section at the end. It's that key word in the mark scheme. You'll come across it several times. It's the word throughout. And you will, I think, find yourself marking more accurately if you do a good read first of all, and then go back to it and go through section by section. Okay, purpose of the independent investigation. Now, if you've downloaded the copy, let's give you 3 or 4 minutes just to scan through that. It's pages 7 to 15 in the copy of the PDF that you've got there. So if you'd like to call that up on screen and have a look at that, I'll just take about 3 or 4 minutes out of our time this afternoon to let you have a quick look at that in case you've not. And when you've done that, if you've already looked at it, you might have time to perhaps think about the second aspect, which is which level do you think this is in, this particular first section, part 1, which level is it? So let me go mute then just for a couple of 3 minutes and give you a chance to have a look at these. Okay, let's take a look at some of the aspects of this piece of work. First of all, if we call a poll up on screen, what level do you think the purpose of the investigation is? If you've had a chance to look at it, even if it was a fairly quick scan read, what level would you place that in? Okay, at the moment it's, well, I'll hopefully show you the poll. There we are, if we share the results. About a third of you are putting it in level 2 and 2/3 of you putting it in level 3. Okay, that's really helpful to know, and we'll spend some time looking at that now and seeing how that reflects in the marks that were actually given. Just going to get rid of that. There we are. Now, in focusing on level 3, I'm going to focus on this most because, first of all, the mark that we gave was level 3, but in case you're thinking, oh, I gave it level 2, it's not a matter of getting these things wrong or thinking it's wrong. What I want to talk you through now is whereabouts in level 3 is it? And you might feel when I'm talking about some of the aspects of it, the work, that actually there are bits where perhaps it sits on the borderline with level 2. We get quite a lot of what we call in the trade bar wobblers. It's a phrase I particularly like. I was introduced to moderation many, many years ago with that phrase bar wobbler, a piece of work that sits on the border between, say, level 2 and 3, or later on level 3 and 4. So what we're looking for, remember the mix of assessment objectives as well. We've got AO1, which is about geographical knowledge. Have we got good, substantive, accurate and relevant geographical knowledge? Secondly, second bullet point, AO2, is the candidate applying understanding to make relevant links which are coherent between the context and the broader geographical context? So what we're really asking there is the student finding out something that's geographically worthy that's going on in Bristol? And is there somewhere else where we might find this same thing going on? So for instance, if you've had a chance to look at the work, you'll see the candidate not just looks at Bristol universities, plural, but also looks at Leeds University as well. And we get the feeling that there's a kind of bigger picture going on here, which the student is pleased to tell us about. And then thirdly, AO3, the skills part of it, if you like, investigates a wide range of relevant sources. So have we got many sources from which the student has drawn their information? And is it used properly to construct a justified aim or question or hypothesis to give a framework for the investigation? So that's the kind of thing. While I've been talking those through, you might, if you've had a chance to look at the work, think, yeah, actually, I think the student has done quite a few of those things. I'd agree with you. I think the student has done quite a few of those things. So let's take a look. Let's break down the criteria first of all. Let's look first of all about geographical knowledge and understanding of location, geographical theory, and comparative context. Some people think, by the way, that comparative context means that the student's got to put in another bolt-on case study. It really isn't. That what the student's done here, which is referring to Leeds as a kind of comparative study that you might find similar things going on to Bristol, that's about the right level, about the right volume too. Students have a hard enough job controlling this beast, this NEA, to within 4,000 words anyway, without giving them additional hurdles to have to jump over. So that's the first thing. The second thing, the applies understanding to find coherent and relevant links between the context and some broader geographical context. You'll find it helpful in the space on the mark sheets, which you'll be using to mark your students' work. It's always really handy to say how and why you've given the level that you have. And you might tick a particular part of the mark scheme, saying things like this: page 7, details on spiral of decline. That might be a really helpful note, so that you know that the student is drawing on spirals of decline as representing some idea of relevant geographical knowledge in this study. And it continues throughout the NEA with comments on the conflicts caused by studentification on page 8, spiral of decline, page 9, 17, and 44. Hence that point about reading through the entire piece of work first of all. So making yourself little notes in that great big wide column once you've decided on the levels, and making comments about why you're awarding level 3 or level 2 or whichever you think is appropriate. To have the evidence there is really helpful, for not just for you in helping you to reach a level, but also in the moderator as well. The moderator can see that you've either been getting it right or perhaps getting a little bit, perhaps you're a little bit fierce or a little bit easy in other ways over the marks you give, but it all helps in the moderation process to think, okay, yes, I can see why the teacher has given that mark. I thought it was worth, say, 8 in level 2. Now I think it's 9 in level 3 because the teacher got that right. So the links to broader geographical context, you've got theory of studentification, that gets a really good airing on page 7 and 8. The broader context of the study, the spiral of decline. There are some improvements that could have been made. Clearly, I think some annotated maps with scales. You don't get a really good sense of place from the 3 maps on page 14. They're really just there to show the location. They don't do a lot more than show the location of Clifton and Bristol. And I think we need a little bit more than that about annotation, about the relevance of Bristol University nationally as a centre for higher education, or whichever way the student decides to go. Something there that says Bristol's significant as a city and other university cities are like this as well. And the study could also, in the final bullet point, have been improved if the student had created perhaps a very simple conflict matrix. The student's gone down the avenue of looking about assessing the conflict caused by studentification. That word conflict could have got a really good airing, I think, in this particular part, so that named stakeholders who might not like, for instance, students appearing, or might prefer students living in parts of cities themselves where there are students, it might be a pleasurable conflict as well as a difficult conflict. That word conflict does need some airing, I think. So what we're beginning to say about this is not a perfect top of level 3. So we're looking at somewhere perhaps further down the list of statements. Then the criteria next about relevant geographical sources, about geographical information, research information, helping to support a justified aim, question, or hypothesis, and a framework for the investigation. Well, how well does the student do that? You've got a wide range of resources. I have to say, what you see in front of you here is compared to many other students, a very wide range of sources. They're all quoted here. They're given dates. Some of them are the course textbook, like the Dunn in 2021. There's that textbook reference there. But there's a bibliography, really some quite detailed sources across the piece, pages 12, 54, 60, and 61. It's generally, as you'll know yourselves as teachers, good to have a bibliography at the end. But you can see why the student's done it that way, in a way, because there would be such a lengthy bibliography. This student might perhaps have been better off using footnotes, maybe, but it's no particular problem. There is a bibliography. It's best practice to have one at the end, but the student has certainly proven that they've done lots of reading. And it then links to the questions selected on page 13, where the students use the 4 conflicts outlined in the proposal form. And each of those is directly relevant and specific to the location. Really does air that very well. So we're already thinking again here, probably, that this is going to be a decent level 3 when it comes to that part of the study. So those 3 inquiry questions and the title, 4 inquiry questions, apologies, on page 13, they're valid, they're logical, and it means that the candidate is setting themselves up a logically structured and comprehensive study. You're not really fighting to think, well, why are they doing that? Student sub-questions don't always make a coherent sense. And don't be afraid to point that out to students and give them support in letting them know that they need to try and develop questions that make sense and that follow on one from the other or are related to each other in terms of building up a higher picture, a better picture. You can do that as a teacher when you're putting the proposal forms together. They can have that kind of advice. Again, I go back to what I was saying, you're not telling them to go out and do 3 environmental quality surveys or anything like that. You're actually helping them structure and make more manageable the study that they can go away and do. The other final thing to say about this study is it's 3 locations in 1 ward, and it's really manageable. It's a manageable and appropriate scale. So where did we end up with as a team? We thought this was level 3, and we ended up giving it 10 marks out of the 12 available in that first section. So to get 12 marks, the student could have used a conflict matrix of various stakeholders involved in studentification, might have helped them to focus on the title and not to drift slightly about looking at impacts as opposed to conflicts. You'll see that occurs a few times through the study. And annotated maps and photographs might have been used to help build an understanding of location or sense of place in many ways. Okay, so 10 then out of the 12 marks. Let's take a look from then on at part 2. And this time, again, if you're looking at that, we're looking at focusing on pages 16 to 24. And again, when you've done that, you can click your poll answer when you've had a chance to do that. I'll go quiet for 2 or 3 minutes, give you a chance to look through those pages. Let me just remind you, it's pages 16 to 24, and we'll put the poll up ready for you for when you've had a chance to look at that. Okay, I can see there's quite an increase now in people entering their marks. If you've reached an impression about where you think this quality of this section B, section 2 rather, lies, if you'd like to enter a level there. I can see from the progress that's been made so far that it's about the same sort of proportion as section 1, which is at the moment the way things are going. We've got about 1/3 of you thinking it's level 2 and 2/3 of you thinking it's level 3. And again, there's rarely any such thing as a perfect piece of work. Sometimes people think, oh, I'm not giving that level 3 because there was a mistake on line 2 of page 36 or something like that. I think we're trying to get a sort of general picture here. Okay, let's just end the poll there and hopefully broadcast the results, share the results to you. So you can see that exactly 1/3 of you think it's level 2, 2/3 of you think it's level 3. Let's see where that goes. So thank you for doing that, and apologies that there isn't a huge amount of time for you to get used to reading these pieces of work, but they're useful nonetheless to get an impression. You can get an impression quite quickly. So that's what we're looking at. We're looking at level 3 this time. That seems to be the one that most of you have chosen. So let's see if it does fit. So this time it's all AO3. Notice the assessment objectives, all skills. So you're looking, first of all, in the first bullet at appropriate methods. That's the key thing, appropriate methods. You might look at the number of methods this student has chosen for data collection and think, well, they're throwing the kitchen sink at it. There's so many there. You can't fault them on the range of data. That range of data, don't ask me how many a suitable number of data collection strategies might be, though I will answer that one later, I promise. But I want to go about it the other way. I think, what does a range of data mean? What kind of information does the student need that's relevant to the topic? Because you can see a lot of data collection here. You certainly can't fault it on him or her on the volume of what's been done. Second bullet point, design a valid sampling framework explicitly linked and appropriate to the geographical focus being investigated. I read that out because if there's one tripwire that sits across the whole mark scheme that makes moderators think, I don't know that this student has really got this. A lot of the students mention different kinds of sampling, and that's all they do, mention it. Have you got a clear idea from what you read that the student has got a really accurate idea of what different sampling methods mean and why they should choose particular sampling methods for particular data? What difference does it make? You really do need quite a round understanding, and I think probably the way I'm framing this you might get a slight hint in my voice that maybe that's not quite what this student is up to so far. But there is a sampling framework, certainly, but I wouldn't say, is that word explicitly linked and appropriate? Perhaps maybe we'll see in a minute, doesn't quite hit the nail on the head. Anyway, third bullet, frequency of timing of observations. You've probably seen that those certainly get a lot of mention in the very first part of the methodology section. Fourth bullet point, research planning shows appropriate and relevant understanding of ethical dimensions. Those must be there. Risk assessments don't have to be there. You might think, well, it's good practice. Don't stop your students doing them if you think you'd like them to do the risk assessment. Your school probably insists that you do them anyway. That's absolutely fine. But they must have research planning of ethical dimensions of field research methods. They must get a look in. And then finally, obtains reliable data. Now, there's two words here that students have really got to focus on. Reliable data. By reliable, I mean, if they went back tomorrow and carried out the survey again from 2 months ago, would they get similar results? Or if they didn't get similar results, would there be a reason why they didn't get similar results that's very identifiable? Second one is accuracy and precision. So accuracy, are what they're doing, can what they're doing be regarded as accurate? That's to say they've done it properly. They haven't skipped over any fences or anything like that and tripped over on the way. Is it accurate? Are they getting accurate results? Sometimes more relevant in physical geography than human, but I think from the range of techniques the students proposed here, we do need to see some accuracy. So let's look at these in a little bit more detail. Let's look at the first three about methods of being appropriate for the range of data, about a sampling framework, and frequency of timing. Now, the student certainly gets a range of data. There's no doubt about it. A whole range of things there which are relevant, including secondary sources such as census data. Very few students use the index of multiple deprivation, and I think that's a shame. There's a lost opportunity there for a lot of students when it comes to background data. Some discussion of the timing, the temporal sampling approach taken on page 17. There is some mention of sampling there and how the students set that up, but the spatial sampling, how and why did they choose those three particular streets or areas of Clifton that they looked at? What was the point of that? So the overall spatial sampling system needs a mention, and it doesn't really get it. Then when it comes to criteria 4 and 5 in the mark scheme about research planning showing appropriate and relevant understanding of ethical dimensions, and then data are reliable and accurate. Well, let's see what we thought about that. There's a clear statement about ethical considerations on page 24, though it's a bit generic. The risk assessment's there, doesn't have to be, but it's there, and that's absolutely fine. The data seem pretty accurate. The property quality survey, the student has gone back for secondary sources to authoritative samples. So that's helpful, I think, the fact that the student has actually spelt out what data they've chosen and what sources those data have come from for secondary. That's really helpful. So we know we've got evidence of accuracy there. And the data can be thought of as precise. You've got the example of decibel readings for noise quality, and they'll give quantitative readings from the survey on page 8. So we've got some evidence in each case. We thought this was only 1 mark off the top, level 3, 9 marks, and some of you might be gasping a little bit if you did give it level 2. Let's look at the big picture. 1, you've got a broad range of relevant data. You might even think there are too many data, but there's very few that you can't really justify a place for. The only one that, and it's a personal thing, I'll be quite honest with you, I have to say footfall measurements really have very little relevance in many surveys. A lot of students get taught these at GCSE and think it's something that they ought to be doing at A level. It really doesn't add a great deal to it. I had one study about regeneration in a town in mid-southern England this last summer, and the student took evidence of footfall as being evidence of the fact that the regeneration scheme in this cathedral city had been a major success, just because for numbers counted at about 1 o'clock on a wet November afternoon when there weren't many people about anyway. Footfall data really aren't terribly evidential. But we've got data that links to the inquiry questions. That's important. It's an individual piece of work, and the fieldwork techniques are therefore being replicated by an individual student. This student's gone out and got themselves a decibel meter downloaded onto their phone. There's a free app. They've got bipolar surveys, which is specifically for their project. One of the things that really will win friends, by the way, when it comes to moderation and you as the marker, is if your students, quite a number of them use published environmental quality surveys with, say, 15 indicators or thereabout and bipolar scale. If students are going to do that sort of thing, it's always best if they can use, say, 7 or 8 of the ones that are published and then come up with another 7 or 8 of their own. Most moderators would rather see something that's a little bit raw and edgy, but which has been devised by the student themselves, rather than something that's just come straight out of a book or a website on how to do an EQS. So I think that's important. The spatial sampling system here could have been more developed, and there may be perhaps too many types of data. As I say, I'd say footfall probably comes under that heading, but it's pretty good nonetheless. It gets 9 marks out of the 10 available for section 2. So I hope that's clear about how and why those marks were awarded in the way that they were. Let's move on to part 3. Now, this is where sometimes, if marks are going to go drift between teacher and a moderator, they sometimes do, because they've got 24 marks to play with. And all you need to say is something's in the middle of level 3, and you end up having a discussion about, no, this is a low level 4 or something like that. Before you know where you are, you're running a difference of about perhaps 3 or 4 marks, which if you do that twice, if you do that on this 24 mark section and the next 24 mark section, suddenly means that your marks might be adrift from another person by about 7 or 8 or something like that. And then you're in trouble, or someone's in trouble anyway. So let's see what you think of this data representation. Now, if you haven't had a chance to look at this, you'll have to skim fairly well through it just to get an impression. But let's give you a couple of minutes just to look through data representation, analysis, interpretation, and evaluation, pages 26 to 54. Scan read it if you can fairly quickly, and let's see what you think. Okay, while you're doing that, some of you may have decided already which level you would put this in. Perhaps we could have the next poll, please, and you can enter what you think is the appropriate level. Okay, well, there's about the low 40s number of people who've registered their level. Mostly, I would have to say, well, 2/3 of people are going for level 3. Okay, well, let's end the poll there. Sorry if you haven't had a chance to complete that and be included in that poll. We've got 45 answers there, so let's just take a look and see what you think of that. Level 3, level 2, we've got 3 people on level 2, 31 people on level 3, and 11 on level 4. Interesting where the balance lies on this one, because one of the reasons why we chose this one for your sample for this afternoon session is because it had us really discussing as examiners last summer. We were looking at this as an exemplar. And that was the level where we started. Now, it's actually helpful sometimes if you're looking at level 3, 4, and we see a lot of student work that comes in on the margin of those two levels. Sometimes you see some marking by teachers, and what they've tended to do is have the level 4 descriptors in front of them, and they start ticking and think, yeah, they've done that, and they've done that, and they've done that. It's almost as though you're hoping that the level 4 will be the outcome. Sometimes, and I've done this when I've been moderating, I start with level 3 and then work upwards from that if I find that the student is actually bettering that. I find it's what I tend to have to focus on is looking at level 3 and I'm thinking, is the student doing this? And I'm often thinking, actually, no, the student's doing more than this. And that's when I start looking at level 4. I've found that schools where perhaps the moderator and the teacher marker are adrift is where perhaps the teacher, and you can understand it, for goodness sake, we've all been there. Yeah, you really want as many level 4s as you can, can't you? Obviously, I mean, who wouldn't want their students to clock up level 4 decisions? But when it comes to actually thinking about, well, what are we really, let's just get a little bit of objectivity here and think about level 3 instead. Have they exceeded level 3 rather than have they met level 4 is sometimes a more useful question to answer. So let's just see what we've got here. We've got 4 things that we're looking for. First, appropriate geographical skills to deconstruct data. That's what we mean by analysis, in order to show partly evidence connections and mostly accurate statistical geographical significance of data. So if that were level 4, it will be showing fully evidence connections and wholly accurate statistical geographical significance of data. So let me give you a clue. Quite often the sort of thing you see is you see a student has done Spearman's rank, they get the R coefficient, and they say, right, I found a correlation, there we are, that's it. That's not going to get you level 4. Significance is really important in the awarding of level 4, and the accurate use of significance in the data is what you want to see for level 4. So what are we seeing in this? We'll break that down in a minute. Secondly, we're looking for a generally balanced appraisal. And in this case, the level 3 descriptor may lack detail in some aspects of techniques and methodologies used, including ethical dimensions of field research, utility and validity of chosen methodologies. Now, the ethical dimensions will come into things like interviews and that kind of thing. But if I perhaps just direct you to a page at the moment, I'd just call up on my own screen. I've got 2 computer screens working here. If you have a look at page 33, and I was thinking, wow, 30th of August, we've got a number of people using different services in Clifton, and look how much bigger it is in the 30th of September. And I think, hang on, wait a minute, it's the same scale. So 30th of September gives a different impression once you actually start looking at the data accuracy and accurately, as opposed to just getting a quick glimpse of it. So page 33, you've got 2 graphs there comparing before and after the arrival of students, and you're led to the impression that the students are having a big impact. They're not. So it's proportions that are set out wrongly. So when you're looking at methodologies for presenting data, I'd be saying, look, we haven't really got level 4 kind of data here. The other thing is a general thing, not just so much for this study. One thing I find really helpful is where data have been presented geographically. That's to say, instead of 8 pie charts, 8 located pie charts on a base map of the area, in the same way as GIS might do, but sometimes it's a bit out with a Pritt stick and a bit of graph paper drawing various located graphs, and then in superimposing a tracing paper map of a street or something like that. A little bit like the land use study that's in this. I forget which page it is. I'll come across it in a minute and let you know. But there's a land use map. Oh yeah, it's on page 34, 35. Quite useful, quite simple, but that simple maps like that probably need a bit more annotation. So again, it's a nice to have. It's a nice thing to have, but you'd like a little bit of annotation just on it to get the analysis rather than just simply the presentation. Anyway, third bullet, synthesizes research findings coherently. Are we getting evidence of that? Are we getting rational conclusions mostly supported by evidence? Now, by conclusions, it's what you would call ongoing conclusions. So you've got those 4 sub-questions. I would expect this analysis to be set out one heading after another. So the 4 headings are dealt with, and at the end of each heading, the end of each bit of data presentation, rational conclusions about each one that are mostly supported by evidence. That's what I'd expect to see if this student were top of level 3 getting towards level 4. And then the final bullet communicates conclusions that are supported by mostly relevant fieldwork data or information presented in a manner that's appropriate and technically accurate. Well, we've already seen a couple of things that maybe aren't quite as technically accurate as they might be. But let's see. Let's move on and have a look at this in detail. So what about geographical skills to deconstruct data? And what about appraisal of techniques and methodologies, really including the utility and validity of chosen methodologies? Right, well, we've got some appropriate geographical skills. We've got radar diagrams, bar charts, land use map. Excuse me. We've also got student t-tests on pages 49 to 51. And not only the t-test, if you've had a chance to glance at that on pages 49 to 51, we've got a rationale for why the students used it as well. And there's an appraisal of the techniques used on page 58 in the conclusion section. That's really helpful. That is really helpful. It gives me some degree of certainty that the student knows not just what they're doing, but why they're doing it, which is really helpful. Next, synthesizing research findings coherently to give some evidence-based conclusions and communicates convincing conclusions supported by clear and technically accurate presentation of fieldwork data. Now, up to this point, I've been thinking, is this level 3? Is it level 4? Now, actually, there's a slight typo here. So let me explain to you what we came up with here. Students got some very good analysis skills, and there's some evidence explanations for all the evidence presented. That's really good. There's very brief concluding statements, but what there isn't is there's no really synthesis of the results either within or between the key questions. So what that paragraph's about is this. The student's done things mostly pretty accurately and appropriately. The student is then, for instance, you've got a land use map, for instance, on, what was it, page 35 or something like that, 34, 35. The students described it and set out clear patterns and how they relate to studentification. You get the same sort of pattern also where you get the radar graphs and other graphs as well. You get a bit of description and explanation of each one. What you don't get, and this is really where the student would land themselves firmly in level 4. What you don't get is synthesis of saying, well, look, this map here shows patterns which I've also seen in other data that I collected about, say, environmental quality or something like that. Or here's something about in my environmental quality results that link to my noise readings, my decibel readings. They look as though they're showing the same sort of pattern. That's what I mean by synthesis. You're getting students to say, look, this set of results and this set of results look like they're connected in some way. And then they go into a third lot of results and say, yeah, I'm finding the same pattern again. It's all adding up to a bigger picture. That's really what you're looking for when it comes to top level 4. What I would also say you're looking for when it comes to top level 4 is things like the second bullet point here. The investigation could have been improved by annotating the photographs. You've got some great pictures. One of the ones that's really stuck in my mind is that one of the recycling container with all the beer bottles in. Now, what's that saying? Is that saying that students are really good at recycling, therefore they're environmentally conscious? Or is it saying that that you just get a load of beer drinking going on when the students are in town? Or what? What's it saying? And how does it fit with the general tone and purpose of the investigation? So those photographs really do need some annotation. They're large, full-page photographs. I think it would have been much better if they'd been size them down by about half and then pepper them with annotations all the way around about what they're actually doing there, what they show about the links, for instance, between the results of the noise survey and property survey. The other thing, and I'll say this finally, because I think we're beginning to see a few holes in this about whether or not it is level 4 or level 3. I would have expected somewhere along the line so far that students might not be getting the blame for all this. When it comes to the environmental quality surveys, there's some good results about things like characteristics of houses that are owned and occupied by students, such as peeling paint and shabby woodwork and that sort of thing. Whereabouts are the property owners in all of this? Aren't they coming up for some sort of degree of responsibility? It's all being pinned on the students. I'd like to have seen something that says there's another dimension to this, which is about people maintaining property and keeping it up. And maybe property owners might have at least got a mention. Okay, what we ended up, and you might think, look at this and think, what? Level 4, 20 marks. We decided that this was pretty well ticked every single box in level 3. And that gives you the push really to say, actually, are there any qualities here in level 4 that we're finding? What we found was that for pretty well every bullet point for level 3, we could place ticks. And the rule of thumb there, particularly important rule for those of you who are new to NEA marking, if you're ticking all the bullet points within a particular level, then the student's work has to go to the top of that level. So if you've got a range of 13 to 18 marks for level 3, as we have in this case, you would say this student has got to be on 18. Now, actually, what we then found was there were some parts where the student has really gone over into another level. So we didn't get a great deal of results being synthesized together, but the explanations were very clear. And they were well linked to theory. If they'd gone beyond explanation and then synthesized the results together, that might have even put them at the top of level 4. But what we thought was we had a range of different methods of presentation. They weren't all perfect, but they were there nonetheless. They all had explanation. So every single result was linked. They pretty well served the links back to theory about studentification. The word studentification, if you give it a search, it occurs, I forget how many times it is, but it's a lot of times, and it occurs all the way through the analysis. The student is relating all the time how the results link back to studentification. Apart from those photographs, sorry for going on about those photos, I think they're such a great resource. It's a pity not more was made of them. But that was just an example of where the student was still nonetheless aware of what it was that she or he was investigating. And it was linked to studentification. Anyway, we came out with 20 on this one. So low level 4. So all the ticks in level 3. When you're getting all the ticks for level 3, you have to go up to the next level and say, right, am I really getting any currency here? Is there anything in level 4 that's worth ticking? And we felt there was. We felt there was just enough to tip it over. 19 is the baseline mark for level 4, and we thought it was just slightly more than the very, very beginning of level 4. So we gave it 20. Okay, well, I hope you're not too upset by that. Most of you came up with level 3, but I think it was a really high level 3, and I think it was worth looking at. Okay, final section. Just have a couple of minutes, not too much to look at this time, pages 55 to 58. If you scan read that, just to guide you, first of all, what you're looking for fundamentally with the conclusions is going back to the main title. The analysis will have dealt with the sub-questions. We expect to see a big hit going on to the main title question and getting an answer to that. And when it comes to the evaluation, we want to see evaluation not just of the methodologies that have been used, but we want to see about the evaluation of the geographical quality of the title, if you like. Is it a a quality geographical investigation? Has the student really found out something that's really worth finding out? And have they done the job well? Okay, have a look at that. I'll give you a couple of minutes and then I'll come back to you. And we'll put the next poll up while you're doing that, please. So pages 55 to 58. If we could put the next poll up, please, then people can enter their marks. Thank you very much. Well, we've got about 30 of you who've made a decision so far, so thanks very much for that. It's less to look at. Perhaps you feel there's, you can get a better sense of what this section's about because there are only 4 pages of text there. Students setting it out pretty well. It's very easy to read. You know what the student's after and they're trying to come to some degree of answers. They're certainly tackling the reliability versus validity and how that might be improved. Anyway, we have 44 of you having decided there, and this time it's more decisive this time. Let's just share the results there, and you can see that 3/4 of you think it's level 3. And there's a slight edge. Just reading from this, I'd say perhaps the overall point in the room is maybe upper level 3, something like that, because more of you are looking at level 4 than level 2. That's really interesting. So we'll take a look at that next and see where we come to, and then we can get a total mark. Well, we're going to look at level 3 in detail in this one, which we thought as a team, examining team, that was where this one belongs. High up in level 3. It's a good level 3. You've certainly got mostly accurate geographical knowledge and applying understanding well. Just get rid of the poll again. We'll go through each of these 6 bullet points in detail. First of all, the first 3. Have we got mostly accurate and relevant geographical knowledge and understanding of location, geographical theory, and comparative context? Remember that one was in section 1 as well. Have we got applies understanding to find largely coherent and relevant links between the conclusions and a broader geographical context? And you'll have seen that, of course, there's some reference to Headingley in Leeds. So we know that the student isn't just focusing on Bristol. And then are they synthesizing most aspects of the return of the research findings? Okay. Well, we've got some relevant geographical knowledge, definitely. We've got the link between students and antisocial crime on page 56, and about positive and negative impacts of students also on that same page. Got mentioning Leeds and similar things going on page 57. It's good geographical knowledge about the location throughout. That's not just in this section. Evidence for criteria can be found anywhere, remember. As in the preceding section, there's little synthesis of the results, and you really would have a higher mark if the student had done this. The student really does need to snowball these results together and let them gather them together and look at them as an entity. What is it they're showing? That breakdown of text, which is very useful in terms of pages 56 to 57, where the student has actually written down their little mini conclusions and answers to the questions. It doesn't really help them to come to an overall big picture. And what you really want the students to be talking is that word conflict. You really want them to tear that apart when it comes to this particular conclusion section. So that lack of synthesis, I think, really doesn't do the student any real favors. And I think that's what holds it at level 3 for this particular part rather than level 4. Anyway, we've got conclusions supported by evidence. Now, that's certainly true. We've certainly got conclusions supported by evidence. It's just the big conclusion that isn't. We've got a good appraisal of reliability of evidence and validity of conclusions. That chart is really very helpful. It's a good thing for students to do that kind of thing. Really helps them to segment their thoughts and argue something very coherently about how well they think they've delivered a reliable finding and reliable evidence, and whether that evidence is valid. And then finally, about a developed argument, about a selection of factors. We've got a developed argument which is a little bit uneven. There are some good bits and bad bits. That's basically what it means. There are logical lines of reasoning. They're not fully developed because of that lack of synthesis, but we've got reference to a structured inquiry, and there's some useful terminology in there. So we've got appraisal, that's fine, that's done well. Sound conclusions really let down by the conflict and the lack of attention to the word of conflict. Overall, there are sound conclusions which are drawn from the preceding section, but there's no real new ground. So we thought that this was level 3, 18 marks. It's top of level 3. You can almost put a tick against every bullet point in level 3. It does those things, but if you start looking into level 4, you'll find that the student is a little bit short on that and doesn't really stray over into level 4 territory. But remember what I said, if you're putting ticks against all the bullets in level 3 at a particular level, then the student has to go to the top of that level, and that 18 represents the top mark within the third band. Okay, well, I hope you found that really useful, because I think that was a piece of work which I think is a nice piece of work. It's repeatable, as I said. I can imagine students I've taught a long time ago doing that kind of piece of work. It's a really helpful piece of work geographically. They get a lot of understanding, a lot of skills, a lot of data. They've really done well in collecting such a range of data. Uses secondary data, reliable sources well. So this piece comes up with 10 marks for section 1, 9 for section 2, 20 for section 3, and 18 for section 4, giving a total of 57. Last year, the A star boundary was 60. And I think, if I remember rightly, the A was 54. So it sits right midpoint between an A and A star. And that's probably where it fits qualitatively. It's not perfect. You don't see many pieces of work that are. It's a bit wordy. That doesn't mean to say, as I'll say in a minute, that there's any penalty involved. There isn't. But it does help, I think, each student to know that each section is worth different marks. And those 224s really have got to be the lion's share of the word count. And that sometimes you get a great deal of analysis, and then the students get close to the deadline and they don't write much more on the conclusion and the evaluation. They let themselves down by perhaps going down to level 3 or even level 2 when it comes to that final section. In this particular case, we felt the conclusion sections could have been improved with that greater element of synthesis. But for a piece of work which it wasn't demanding in terms of equipment, only really clipboards and things like that, it's a pretty good piece of work. And I think it really gives a good spirit of what the NEA is about. I don't know how you find those marks, but that for me would sit pretty well middle of A. It's a safe A. The student's not going to be looking for a remark on that one. I would imagine they'd be well happy with that sort of mark. And it's a decent piece of work. Okay, well, we've reached the time of 5:15 exactly. So I'm just going to spend the last 5-10 minutes going through frequently asked questions. These are about the ones that most commonly occur when John Walton is dealing with lists of questions that teachers have asked through the year. These are some of the questions that come up. And you can also post questions in the group chat after this section. We'll have a little bit of time to try and respond to those if any crop up that are unanswered so far. So let's just go through these. First of all, purely procedural one, what happens if you've got students who miss field work that you've carried out for whatever reason? They were ill or they had a mock exam on a particular day, whatever reason. If there are exceptional reasons for students who can't fulfill the 4-day fieldwork requirement and they've had a chance to complete it, it's fine to sign the fieldwork statement and upload it by the 15th of May. And what the head has to, or your principal has to say, is that they confirm the fieldwork occasions and the students have had the opportunity to attend. And the student still has to complete the NEA or lose 20% of the marks. They may have a different amount of primary data compared to other students, data that they've collected, but they must collect data themselves, perhaps in the local environment. Perhaps they might even choose a slightly different topic and something that they can study locally, a little bit like this piece of work we've been looking at this afternoon. But some field work skills will need to be taught, maybe classroom based, followed by independent data collection. But it does mean that the student does have to do that piece of work in order to fulfill the criteria for getting a mark for this particular component of the course. Second common question, do all students have to run 4 days of fieldwork? So do they have to have 4 days? So independent student-led fieldwork can make up some of the 4 days, not all. students do need to be taught field work skills. So you can't just sort of say, right, well, there's 4 days on the calendar, we don't have to do anything, and no responsibility on the part of the teacher. It's important to teach those skills that are important to cover both physical and human processes. Quite perfectly okay to have 2 days skills teaching, 2 days private independent data collection. A lot of colleges and schools do that. But I think one of the things that's important is that students do go off and they add to the data that have come out of some of the teacher-led days. One of the problems that does occur is where you find, say, a sample of, let's say for the sake of argument, 10 students in a cohort. The work arrives on the moderator's desk and they've all done the same sort of data because they all went on the teacher-led day and that's all they've done. The students really have got to add to that data that they collected. And they've got to go off and do some really quite different sort of work that makes their work very different and stands out as being uniquely theirs. And that can be both secondary sources and primary sources. I think for students to assume, or teachers to assume, that they can do it all within 1 day's data collection, I think is underselling the students. And you do see pieces of work sometimes that don't have that kind of quality. This student is clearly, that we've been looking at this afternoon, has clearly done at least 2 days work. It looks actually to me to be rather more than 2 days work there, but clearly they've gone in at the end of August, they've gone at the end of September, they've got comparative data. You can tell there's 2 days there. That's the kind of thing that really leaves no doubt in the moderator's mind that the work has been done properly. And the other students from the same centre, I'm sure, will be doing independent work in the same way on different topics. So yes, teacher-led skills and fieldwork occasions are important, but they really must be an absolute minimal base from which to run the NEA. How many data collection methods do my students need to include across the top level in the mark scheme? Well, if you go down to the 3rd bullet point, you need to see at least 3 or 4, or maybe 5 at the most. I attack this from a different point of view. If we take this student, let's imagine that this student was looking at 3 aspects of studentification in Bristol, in Clifton. Let's say one of those aspects was economic. So what economic impacts or economic experiences do students have, or does Clifton have, as evidence of studentification? Then what about social aspects of studentification, and then environmental aspects? I would probably expect to see 2, possibly even 3 sets of data for each of those questions for the job to be done well. Now, let's say there were 2 primary methods. So, for instance, for environmental impacts of studentification, I might expect an environmental quality survey and I might expect annotated photographs. But then I start compiling the list and I think, well, I'd like some noise data as well, so some decibel readings. And I'd also like some air quality data, secondary data from my local authority. Suddenly you've got yourself a real menu of reliable, good quality data sources that are going to make some sense. I think if you have students who sometimes do footfall and 1 brief questionnaire with about 4 questions as their evidence of economic success of regeneration, then they're not going to do justice to the question, the title question that they've got. And you do see those, I'm afraid. It's a great shame, but you do. So rather than saying 3, 4, or 5 at the most, I'd rather say, think about the questions, think about what data you need for each of those sub-questions, and compile maybe 2, maybe 3, perhaps 2 plus 2, 2 primary, 2 secondary for each of those sub-questions. And I think you've got a fairly minimal approach there to what students need to do. Secondary data are slightly different because students need maps. Some need secondary sources like house prices to help focus what they're going to be investigating. They might want further secondary sources like the index of multiple deprivation, for instance, to help support or interpret their data. And then they might need secondary sources like if they found an article in Geography Review or something similar where they want to add something as well because they found out something about air quality in cities generally or in areas of regeneration, they want to add that as well. So you might put a limit on the number of primary sources that students might have, but you probably want to let them have free rein when it comes to secondary, because they often, students who do secondary data well, really do themselves a great big favor in terms of the mark that they get and the quality of their work. Do they need to include a statistical test? No, they don't. They can, but it has to be appropriate. And so if, for instance, you see a student doing chi-square based on 4 sample data readings, you know that's not going to work. This student has come across a small sample of work in the work on Clifton and has done the student t-test entirely appropriately. What we don't see very much of is interviews, really good interviews, which have been coded, or even word bubbles, word clouds that are then coded about what kind of things people are saying. If they, for instance, I don't know, like coming to Cornwall on holiday or something like that, you know, get a word cloud together and then look at the nature of the words. What are they telling you about the place? Is it they think that there's something they like about it environmentally or culturally, or what are the words? So coding is something that's very, very understated in most A-level NEAs, and that's a shame. It's a good quality technique to use. Some of the best NEA have hypothesis testing at their heart, do really well. Some of the worst NEA, weakest NEA also have hypothesis testing in their heart, and they don't really get to grips with it. Statistical tests, I think if you're doing something scientific particularly, has to be on the menu if you're doing hypothesis testing. Stats tests are really important from that point of view, but they're not absolutely essential, and students don't have to have them. They just help in appropriate circumstances. Okay, finally, a few things on titles. Student titles are all quite similar with the moderator penalised. No, we don't penalise, we're told not to penalise. It's just the centre's responsibility to make sure there's no plagiarism. And if there are questions, for instance, coming up about AI, the policy, general policy last summer and the guidance given to teachers, or to moderators, was that you treat AI in exactly the same way as you would treat secondary sources. So if a student, suddenly their reading age, you can always detect when a student's reading age has kicked up a level when they start using adult sources and they start using sources that aren't theirs. If they're honest, they will say, I got this from such and such a source. And the same needs to be said for AI. Secondary resources are often the thing that really tease apart often quite similar looking projects with similar titles. And sometimes secondary sources are really the thing that saves the day. Do have concerns, though, about plagiarism. Having secondary sources used in abundance is one thing. Different reading age, different writing styles stand out a mile. They'll stand out a mile to you, they stand out a mile to moderators. And if there are concerns over plagiarism, if you've got concerns about plagiarism, just say so. It doesn't mean to say the student's going to get bawled out or anything like that, but similarity of titles might be an issue only if there are concerns about plagiarism that run alongside it. Let the differentiation between your students come out much more in the selection of the range of sources. Get them doing their own individual sources on top of the things that you've done with them. Make sure that they research the comparative context and make broader geographical considerations that looks different one student from another. When you place the pieces of work next to each other, let them look different. The use and selection of secondary data, the use of the index of multiple deprivation, for instance. If students are doing slightly different areas, you can divvy up parts of the council ward very, very easily so that each student gets their own independent discriminate area or bit, if you like. And then finally, the quality of the analysis, synthesis, evaluation, and conclusions drawn in the final 2 sections. They need to be really clearly different. So hopefully that will help you. It is a problem, very definitely, about similar titles, but hopefully you can avoid that. Finally, word count, 10,000 word plus studies. A lot of them are labors of love. There's no restriction. 4,000 words is a guide, it's not a limit, and you use the assessment criteria only, and there's nothing in the assessment criteria anywhere about the number of words. There are references to relevance, coherence, conciseness, and so on, but nonetheless, you don't have any descriptors within the assessment criteria to say that 4,000 words plus is, you've gone over the limit and you'll be penalized. That doesn't happen. Okay, I'm just going to ask John now, if the last couple of minutes there are any questions that I ought to try and answer over the microphone. John, do you want to say anything now about anything that has cropped up?
Yeah, there was something actually. What would your expectations be of top-level work that considers both frequency and timing of observations and synthesis research findings coherently to form rational evidence-based conclusions? I think it's something you went over. Yeah, it says if you don't mind going back over that, Bob.
Yeah, so timing and frequency.
Yeah.
I think this student did it well, the timing and frequency. So if you're going to look at the effects of studentification in a city, to go there first before the students arrive sets a baseline. And that's really good. So I think that's where timing is really important. And then to go along a month later when you know the students are going to be there, that's your frequency and timing issue dealt with straight away. So that's important. What you're trying to avoid in terms of frequency are 3 questionnaires on Dorking High Street on a wet day in November, and then trying to say that you've got a data set, and if it's 11 o'clock in the morning or that sort of thing, and you quickly wanted to dart in so that you could get back in the minibus and be back in school for the afternoon, that doesn't help frequency or timing. But I think for students to go back on several days and identify the days when they go back and how many they're going to collect, how many environmental quality surveys are they going to get, and why that number, if they're taking a small housing estate on a regeneration project, why have they decided that 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever locations, and where those locations will be? What's the reason for the number chosen and where you chose to do them? And so you get down not just to frequency and timing, but also sampling as well. And if you're going to go sampling particular parts of a housing estate, say in September, do you want to go back in November and see what it looks like on a wet day in autumn? That kind of thing. So what's the substance? It's basically how many questions or how many items, how many data sets do you need to be able to answer your questions substantially? That's where you get the answer to your question about frequency and timing. What was the next bit of the question, John? Was it to get to level 4?
Synthesis research findings coherently to synthesize research findings coherently to form rational evidence-based conclusions. I think you went over that, but
well, I did, but I'll say it again briefly because I think it's really important.
It's important.
For me, analysis is all about the analysis of individual data sets, and as you do, if you like, if you sort of cover the explanation of one data set, and then you move on to another data set, and you begin to see that there are similarities. So, for instance, you've got environmental quality. And you notice that environmental quality is particularly high along the western edge of the high street, and people seem to like shopping along the western edge of the high street. Then your pie charts that show people's preferences for data shopping will show the same sort of pattern as your environmental quality results about that side of the high street. And then you might notice as well how many people have traveled to shop in that particular high street, and you might find that everybody who shopped in the western part of the high street had got there by car, whereas other people in the eastern part of the high street had arrived by bus. And you might start to draw conclusions about the people in the if you like, the target economic audience of people who are shopping on the western side of the high street. You're beginning to make links between results. Excuse me. And you're just saying, look, I've got this one set of results, but that's not enough. Do other results that I'm getting show similar kinds of patterns? Or if they don't, is there a reason why they don't show similar kinds of patterns? Because as soon as you make links between one data set and another, and then another, and then another, that's called synthesis. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think that's great. The only other thing, Bob, is about comparative context. There's a real confusion about what that really means. And also it talks about comparative context throughout, which I took to mean like just not a bolt-on stuck at the front, just to
absolutely.
say, yeah. but
You don't want a bolt-on case study. This student
yeah,
could have done a little text box of about 500 words and saying about studentification in Leeds, which might not have had any real meaning at all. What the student's done is refer to Leeds about 3 times, I think I counted when I did a search earlier. Mentions Leeds in different contexts. This is going on in Leeds, or this happened in Leeds because, or property in Leeds compared to Bristol is less because. And it's just that comparative context is to say Bristol isn't the only place in the universe. There are other places where this is going on. It doesn't need to be a great big case study. I think the rumor got round in the early years that perhaps it was, and it really isn't.
thank you. And there's some questions about the repetition in the mark scheme, which I know is there, and I guess it's kind of just going back to your point about being holistic.
Yeah.
When marking it, that you raised
Yeah.
at the beginning. Mm.
Well, I mean, you would want to see the use of other sources. Geographical context, I think is the wording in section 1, and you might want to see geographical context, that same bullet in section 4, because they've got different relevance. One is to introduce you to it, the other one's to help you draw a conclusion.
Okay, thank you. There's a question about difference between analysis and interpretation, but I think we that's a big question.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm looking at the clock and it's 17:34
Yeah.
now. So can I just whip through and make sure that I've got these final slides shown, John, please? Is that all right? Do you mind?
Yeah.
So these are just a few questions about where you can get further support. First of all, John, the person you just heard and who's been answering your questions all afternoon, John's the geography subject advisor. And if you click on the details on that screen, when you get this, by the way, to get the recording, you simply click on the link you got to get you into this session, and you'll be able to play back the presentation. So if you click on that, you'll get the details for how to contact John and how to get qualification news and support for geography and other areas. And then fieldwork and the independent investigation. There are 6 sources here which are really useful for you. I'm going to add a 7th to that, not just the A-level and AS Geography Fieldwork Planner and Guide, which is an excellent guide. There is also the RGS free guide to writing up your independent investigation. Is it writing up the NEA or something like that, or student handbook, NEA for the handbook? Anyway, it's on the RGS website and it's free, and it doesn't do anything that isn't allowed. It just helps students with the various complexities of how to do a decent NEA. And if they need to know how to do things like chi-square and when to do things like chi-square, it'll help to tell them without compromising you as a teacher. Assessment services, you probably know about Exam Wizard and Results Plus, but I'll leave those this slide here, and access to scripts as well. You're probably aware of those facilities. And that's what we've done this afternoon. The marks awarded to an NEA exemplar. Hope that's met most of the answers to most of your questions anyway, and how the work met the criteria in the mark scheme and how we ended up with the mark that we did. This is one of those sessions that probably needs 2 hours, but nonetheless, hour and a half. Hope it was full enough for you to get something from it this afternoon, and it was useful. And good luck in marking your NEAs this year. There's a final link about Pearson's Professional Academy, and that's where we end the session. So look, thanks very much for being along this afternoon. Bit of a rush, but I hope you got the answers to some of the questions, particularly some of the who are new to this business. The NEA is a great thing to do, and I think students who go to university ought to do one. There you are. I'll leave that with you, and you can debate that with a beer in your hand or a gin and tonic or something like that. Thanks very much for listening. Cheers.